It began with a funeral that felt more like a warning. On July 4th, 2025, the Bishop Briggs crematorium overflowed with mourners, hardened faces from Glasgow's underworld, standing shoulder to shoulder in tense silence. They weren't just burying Ross Monaghan and Eddie Lyons Jr. They were burying any illusion that peace had ever existed between the Lyons and Daniel clans. Two men executed on the sun-soaked streets of Spain. One message whispered through the crowd: this war isn't over. But what keeps it alive after 24 years? On the evening of May 31st, 2025, an masked gunman walked into an Irish bar in Fuengirola, Spain. It was Champions League final night. The place was packed. He raised his weapon toward Eddie Lyons Jr., a 52-year-old Scotsman nursing a drink at the bar. The gun jammed. For 3 agonizing seconds, the only sound was the metallic click of a failed mechanism. Lyons turned. Their eyes met. The gunman cleared the chamber and fired. Lyons dropped instantly. Then the shooter turned and sprinted after Ross Monaghan, the bar's owner, who was already running for his life through the kitchen. He didn't make it. Both men were dead before the police arrived. When Spanish investigators traced the suspect's movements, they discovered something chilling. The killer had an escape route mapped to Portugal. His phone pinged towers in Scotland days before, and the weapon, sourced through channels linked to a crime family 2,000 miles north in Glasgow. This wasn't a random hit. This was the latest chapter in a war that had been raging for 24 years. A war that began with £20,000 worth of cocaine and a moment of youthful arrogance that would leave dozens dead. To understand why 2 middle-aged men died in a Spanish resort town in 2025, you have to go back to Glasgow, back to 2001, back to a cramped safe house in Milton, one of the city's roughest neighborhoods, where the Daniel family stored their product. Jaime Daniel had built an empire on heroin in the 80s and 90s, then pivoted to cocaine as the market shifted. He was methodical, calculating, respected. But respect in Glasgow's underworld isn't given. It's maintained through fear. And in the summer of 2001, a group of teenagers decided they weren't afraid. They called themselves the Club Boys. Among them were Ross Monaghan and Eddie Lyons Jr., both in their late teens, both hungry for reputation. They knew about the safe house. They knew the Daniels kept weight there. So they broke in, took £20,000 worth of cocaine and sold it on the street. They didn't pay the Daniels a penny. It was, by any measure, a colossal miscalculation. Because in the criminal underworld, theft isn't just about money. It's about power. It's about what happens when word gets out that you got robbed by kids and did nothing. Jaime Daniel demanded repayment. The Lyons family refused. And just like that, a £20,000 debt became a blood feud. What no one could have predicted was how deep it would go, how personal it would become, or how many lives it would consume over the next 2 decades. The Daniels needed to send a message, so they turned to their enforcer, a young man in his 20s with protruding front teeth and a nickname that didn't match his brutality: Carroll, known as Gerbil on the streets. Carroll had a personal stake in this. Allegedly, he'd been bullied by members of the Lyons crew when they were younger. Now, he had the power to settle old scores. And he did. Carroll's tactics were medieval: kidnappings, beatings, psychological warfare designed not just to hurt, but to humiliate. For 5 years, both sides traded blows, drive-bys, ambushes, close calls. The city's underworld watched nervously. This wasn't business anymore. This was existential. But what happened next would shock even the police.
On a cold November night in 2006, Carroll and a group of associates drove to Lynn Cemetery in Glasgow. They parked near the grave of Gary Lyons, the 8-year-old brother of Eddie Lyons Jr., who had died of leukemia in 1991. They attached a tow rope to the headstone, and they ripped it from the ground with a 4x4. The grave was left desecrated, destroyed. The message was clear. Nothing was sacred, not even the memory of a child. In the brutal logic of gang warfare, there are still lines you don't cross. Attacking a dead child's grave is one of them. The Lyons family was devastated. and raged, and suddenly there was no possibility of peace. Because how do you negotiate with someone who would do that? How do you let that go? You don't. 3 weeks later, on December 6, 2006, two masked gunmen walked into Apple Motors, a garage in Lamb Hill where several Lyons family members were working. They opened fire. Michael Lyons, 21 years old and a cousin of Eddie Jr., was killed instantly. Stephen Lyons, Eddie's older brother, took multiple rounds but survived. Another man, Robert Pickett, was critically wounded. The shooters were Raymond Anderson and James McDonald. Both were caught. Both were convicted. And in 2008, they received life sentences with 35-year minimum terms, the longest in Scottish history at that time. But the convictions didn't end the war. They escalated it, because now there were bodies on both sides, and in this world, bodies create debts. Debts that must be paid.
For 3 years, the feud simmered. Both families regrouped. The Daniels tightened security, the Lyons prepared. And on January 13, 2010, in the parking lot of an Asda supermarket in Roberyston, Kevin Carroll paid the ultimate price. He was ambushed in broad daylight, shot more than 10 times. Families with shopping carts scattered as the sound of gunfire echoed across the lot. Carroll died where he fell. The execution was precise, military grade, and it sent a clear message. The Lyons had not forgotten the grave, they had not forgotten Michael, and they would not stop. Ross Monaghan was arrested and tried for the murder in 2012. He was acquitted. The evidence was circumstantial. Witnesses were too terrified to talk. But another man, William Patterson, a known hitman for the club boys, had fled to Spain. He was extradited in 2015, convicted and sentenced to life with a 22-year minimum. Justice, in a sense, had been served. But the war was far from over. Between 2010 and 2016, the feud appeared to cool. Police crackdowns had decimated both organizations. Jaime Daniel was aging and ill. Eddie Lyons Sr. faced charges for financial crimes. Open violence declined, but beneath the surface, nothing had changed. The grievances were still there. The hatred was still there. And when the old guard began to fall, the new generation would prove even more ruthless. Jaime Daniel died in July 2016 at the age of 58. Cancer took him, but his death left something far more dangerous: a power vacuum. For years, Jaime had kept the conflict contained. He was strategic, methodical. He understood that all-out war was bad for business. But with him gone, restraint disappeared. And into that vacuum stepped a man who had every reason to want revenge. Stephen Lyons, Eddie Jr.'s older brother, the man who had survived the Apple Motors massacre with bullets still lodged in his body. He had fled to Spain years earlier, then moved to Dubai, where he operated in luxury and safety. From there, he coordinated a campaign of terror that would push Glasgow to the brink. Between late 2016 and 2017, there were 5 attempted murders in 5 months. The attacks were brazen, calculated, and designed to send a message. On May 18, 2017, Stephen Daniel, Jaime's nephew, was leaving a Rangers football match when he realized he was being followed. The attackers had placed a GPS tracker on his car. They chased him at over 100 miles per hour through Glasgow's streets. They rammed him off the road, and when his car came to a stop, they dragged him out and attacked him with a machete. His nose was nearly severed. His face was permanently disfigured. He survived, but barely. The attack wasn't just about killing. It was about dominance, about making the Daniels afraid to exist. There were drive-by shootings, sword attacks on bystanders. A man named Ryan Fitzsimmons was slashed simply for being in the wrong place. Homes were firebombed. Businesses were torched. The city was watching its underworld spiral into chaos, and the police were watching too. In 2018, authorities launched a massive operation. They arrested 6 Lyons associates, including Robert Pickett, the man who had survived the 2006 massacre. The trial took place in May 2019. All 6 were convicted of conspiracy to murder. Combined, they received 104 years in prison. The judge was blunt. "You sought to turn Glasgow into a war zone," he said. "There is no place for jungle law in this city." It was a significant victory for law enforcement. But it didn't end the feud, because the war had already evolved. It had gone global, and a new player was about to enter the game. His name was Ross McGill, born in Glasgow, raised in violence. At 31, he was living in Dubai, running a crew called Tamagunto, which means we are together in Spanish. He was nicknamed Miami for his flashy lifestyle, luxury cars, designer clothes, yachts. He styled himself as Mr. Big. But beneath the glamour, McGill was a businessman, and in 2021, he had a problem. He'd been scammed in a cocaine deal. The buyer was linked to Mark Richardson, a major drug boss in Edinburgh, who had ties to the Daniel family. Richardson was in prison, but his network was still active. McGill wanted revenge. More importantly, he wanted market share. So he reached out to the Lyons family with a proposition. "Team up with me," he said. "We'll destroy the Richardson-Daniel network together, and we'll split the spoils." The Lyons agreed, and with that handshake, the feud entered its most violent phase yet.
Between 2022 and 2025, central Scotland became a war zone. McGill and the Lyons didn't just attack rivals, they terrorized them. Homes were firebombed while families slept. Drive-by shootings were filmed and posted to social media with music and taunting captions. It was psychological warfare in the digital age. They weren't just trying to kill their enemies, they were trying to humiliate them, break them, make them too afraid to fight back. The Daniels retaliated. In May 2024, they firebombed the taxi belonging to the father of McGill's girlfriend. In early 2024, they opened fire on homes in Edinburgh. Children were inside. In April 2025, they coordinated 4 firebombings in a single night. One house had a child asleep upstairs. The police were overwhelmed. They formed a task force of over 100 officers, but as the Scottish Police Federation admitted, they were chronically underfunded. The gangs had more money, better weapons, and fewer rules. Still, they pushed forward. Operation Portal Edge resulted in 55 arrests, firearms, arson, organized crime. But even as suspects were led away in handcuffs, everyone knew the truth. The feud would continue, because it always did. And then there was the international dimension, because this wasn't just a Scottish story anymore. The Lyons family had spent years in Spain's Costa del Sol, living among expats and criminals who had fled the UK. While there, they formed an alliance with one of Europe's most dangerous cartels, the Kinahan cartel. Led by Daniel Kinahan, an Irishman with global reach, the Kinahans controlled cocaine routes from South America to Europe. Together, the Lyons and the Kinahans became known as the Celtic Cartel. Stephen Lyons was the key liaison, and in 2023, that partnership bore fruit. Off the coast of Ireland, authorities seized the MV Matthew, a vessel carrying £157 million worth of cocaine. Investigators believe the Lyons helped orchestrate the shipment. The feud was no longer just about Glasgow. It was about international drug trafficking, European cartels, transnational organized crime, and that made it infinitely more dangerous. Which brings us back to Fuengirola, back to that Irish bar on Champions League final night, back to Eddie Lyons Jr. and Ross Monaghan. Both men had been part of this war from the beginning. They'd stolen the cocaine in 2001. They'd survived 2 decades of retaliation. They'd built lives in Spain, thinking distance would keep them safe. It didn't. The gunman who killed them was arrested in Liverpool days later. His phone records showed contact with Scotland. Spanish investigators told their Scottish counterparts that the suspect was a professional, a hitman linked to the Daniel family. Police Scotland publicly denied that the murders were orchestrated from the UK, but experts weren't convinced. The escape route, the timing, the weapon sourcing – it was too sophisticated to be coincidence. And if the Daniels were responsible, there was another terrifying possibility – retaliation. Because Eddie Lyons Jr. and Ross Monaghan weren't just members of the Lyons family. They were connected to the Kinahan cartel, and the Kinahans don't forgive. On July 4, 2025, Scotland came to a standstill. At Bishop Briggs Crematorium in East Dunbartonshire, 2 funerals were held. Eddie Lyons Jr., Ross Monaghan, side by side. Dozens of mourners gathered under the watchful eyes of police. Officers filmed every face, recorded every license plate, because they knew that in this world, funerals aren't just about grief. They're about strategy, about seeing who shows up, who's still in the game. The ceremony was somber, emotional, but beneath the surface, everyone understood what it meant. This war wasn't over. It was just entering a new chapter. And it's not just the headline murders that keep this conflict alive. It's the constant, grinding violence. The 16-year-old and 20-year-old arrested in April 2025 for 5 counts of attempted murder. The failed 500,000-pound drug deal that sparked retaliatory arson attacks. The firebombings that never make the national news but destroy lives just the same. This is a war sustained by low-level terror, by a generation raised in violence who know nothing else. And as long as that cycle continues, there will be no peace. Because vengeance doesn't have an expiration date. Reputation can't be rebuilt through compromise. And in the world these men inhabit, backing down is the same as dying. 24 years, dozens dead, hundreds arrested, millions spent on policing, and it all started with 20,000 pounds worth of stolen cocaine and a refusal to say sorry. Today, the Daniel family is weakened but not destroyed. The Lyons family is scattered across Europe and the Middle East, operating from Dubai and Spain. Ross Miami McGill is still free, still dangerous, still plotting his next move. And in the streets of Glasgow, Edinburgh, and beyond, young men with no memory of 2001 are picking up guns and carrying forward a war they didn't start but feel obligated to finish. The question isn't whether the violence will continue. It's how many more will die before someone, somewhere, decides that enough is enough. But as the mourners filed out of that crematorium on a warm July afternoon, one thing was painfully clear. That day hasn't come yet, and until it does, the bodies will keep falling. Because this is a war without end, a blood debt that can never be repaid, and a reminder that in the underworld, some grudges are eternal. And with cartel alliances deepening and power still up for grabs, one haunting truth remains. This story isn't finished. So the question is, who will survive the next chapter? If you want to see how global cartels, old-school enforcers, and new-age gangsters collide in Britain's hidden criminal empires, subscribe to Inside the Secret World of Mafia Titans, hit the bell, and join us for the next deep dive into the world few dare to expose.